Hey everyone, Nick here from 4Player Podcast. 2020 may be a full-blown disaster for the world at large, but the gaming community has luckily been blessed with some huge blockbuster hits in the past few months. Chief among them is, of course, Ghost of Tsushima. Aside from being a beautiful open-world action game that brings feudal Japan to life in stunning detail, it is also a game that strives to pay homage to legendary filmmaker Akira Kurosawa. Now, I'm no expert on the subject myself, so I sat down with Krispy, our resident film buff, to talk about the game and how effective the team at Sucker Punch is at achieving this lofty goal. Enjoy.
So I mostly got into samurai films just from studying film history courses. Like I took a number of film history courses, and it kind of is just inevitable that you're eventually going to go back to samurai movies and Akira Kurosawa specifically, because they have such a like linked destiny with Western movies. Which I was already a fan of, you know, things like Fistful of Dollars and Good, Bad, the Ugly, stuff like that. Those were largely reactions to a lot of what samurai movies were doing right around that exact same time. Because that, like, the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was the big period for samurai cinema. Or chanbara, as it's called in Japan, which I think literally means sword fighting film. But yeah, that was when like Akira Kurosawa was really big. That's when Kobayashi was really big, and these were the guys who were kind of like the most famous in samurai movies, and they were the guys who grew up watching stuff like John Ford, you know, so they were watching like old westerns and going like, that's amazing, why we should do that, but like with samurai, you know, with something Japanese. And that's kind of how you get the modern conception of what chanbara are. And like I remember watching Yojimbo. That's the first one I saw, right? And just being like completely struck by the visual style of it, because Kurosawa particularly has this just like distinct way of building a frame that you don't see a lot of people around him. Like his contemporaries weren't filming like that, but you do see a lot of people who come after him who were very influenced by that style, and to like go back and look and see in these old like movies from the 60s to see visual styles that were not only like really popular in the West, but also like I was into anime a lot when I was in high school, right? So to be able to see like on film like the kind of stylizations and like
the kind
framing,
of action and stuff.
Yeah, the action like framing techniques that are like pretty bog standard in anime, because like everybody who works in anime grew up idolizing Akira Kurosawa. So you just see his idea of action everywhere. Yeah. And it's incredible.
Well, so I'm kind of at the opposite end of that spectrum in that I didn't have a ton of exposure to like samurai fiction. And in fact, I didn't really even kind of make the connection between the Western genre and samurai films until I started talking to you about this, and we were starting to get excited for Ghost of Tsushima. So I thought that was really interesting. I'm not really a history buff. I don't really know a ton about the period, and I had never seen a Kurosawa film until we started preparing for this game. In fact, on your recommendation, I went and watched Yojimbo, and then we watched Seven Samurai together, which was great and a really eye-opening experience for me.
Yeah.
For me, growing up, it was kind of, the usual suspects. Like you said, anime. I was into anime when I was younger, and certain video games that kind of got me interested in the setting and culture. I think
you were a fan of like Western stuff, though, right? Like
yeah, but
you're
even
really
then,
into like cowboys. Had you ever seen like spaghetti westerns?
I've seen a few, but to be honest, now that I feel like I have a better understanding of what makes Kurosawa films so special, I want to go back in and fill those gaps, because I think there are a lot of them, especially in the Western genre, and even the Western genre. I feel like video games are kind of responsible for sparking my interest, because
Sure.
I didn't think I was a huge fan until Red Dead Redemption came out, and then I played that and I adored it. So now I'm kind of eager to go back and fill in some of those gaps there. But like, as far as samurai, and it's not the exact same thing. It's not samurai necessarily, but I grew up on Tenchu stealth assassins, which is very different, but it gave me an appreciation for like the period and stuff.
Yeah, that definitely like deals with. I'm not entirely sure about Tenchu, but it kind of looks like it takes place in that Sengoku period, which is really common in samurai films and like Chunbao, because that's a really interesting period in Japanese history. That's like the Warring States period.
Absolutely.
And you, yeah, I mean, even in Tenchu, like, you might not be playing a samurai, but you definitely get a lot of like that atmosphere. And
in that game it was more of a ninja focus, but but there was a lot of overlap in terms of the depiction of the culture and like the political unrest and the events going on and that kind of stuff. So
yes. Well, okay, it's a big question.
It is, yes.
But Akira Kurosawa was, he was a filmmaker who was active particularly during the first half of the 20th century. He's Japanese. He worked and lived in Japan his entire life. He started making movies, he started making the kind of movies that he wanted to make, like, right after World War II.
Yeah.
So before that, he was working in the Japanese studio system, but he was really restricted on what kind of content he could make. They had a lot of rules about what subject matter was like off limits during wartime, right?
Yeah.
So after the war, he finally is kind of given this like free reign to like write what he wants to write and shoot what he wants to shoot. So he goes off and he kind of he starts dabbling in like film noir, which was still very vital and like still very much like a thing at that time. And he does some movies about like gangsters and yakuza. He does a lot of stuff that's very much about post-war Japan, and from there he starts going back into like the chanbaras, into samurai films, and he's always been a very like socially conscious director, right?
Yeah.
So his movies were kind of always about Japan, but they were also always about like human nature.
Okay.
And he had a pretty like I don't know how best to describe it, but he had a pretty stark view of like war and violence, and he was one of the first Japanese directors who was making movies about samurai that didn't depict them as just being like completely honorable heroes,
Yeah, they're all kind of flawed.
Right. He depicted them as people. He depicted them as like as things would have been, more or less. Seven Samurai, which he did in 1954, is probably his most famous film. That's like the first samurai film that like hits outside of Japan. And that's the one that like a lot of people like John Milius and George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and Francis Ford Coppola, like these American guys were seeing Seven Samurai and Yojimbo and stuff, and that's like what was driving them crazy and like inspiring them to do the kind of stuff that they went out and did.
It's kind of amazing because before we were while we were getting ready to record this and whatnot, you recommended a lot of videos kind of to flesh out some of the background about Akira Kurosawa and his influences and whatnot. And one of them specifically, I don't remember the title of it, but I'll include it in the show notes or whatnot. But it was basically about his influences and how it's kind of, you can see little bits and pieces of it in like so many huge films, even in the West, and seeing where some of those, like, and they had like side by side comparisons that where it's impossible to kind of not see the similarities. And it was in everything from like Star Wars to like Lord of the Rings. It was incredible.
I mean, even when movies aren't kind of just like whole cloth inspired by stuff that he's done, like Seven Samurai, the story of Seven Samurai has been remade so many times. The most famous and obvious example is Magnificent Seven, but even
which is essentially the same story but a Western, right?
Right, it's the exact same story but a Western, right? And A Bug's Life is the exact same story, but bugs.
That's the one that I remember going, what?
Yeah. When you see it, you're like, oh my god, like it's kind of crazy. But even just like shots, like he wasn't just. He was just so good at like everything, you know?
Yeah.
He was there's an old saying at Toho Studios that like the people that worked for him, they called him, so they said that he was Toho Studios' best writer, he was Japan's best director, and he was the world's best editor.
Damn.
And he was so involved. Like I generally speaking am kind of critical of auteur theory, but if it ever applied to anybody, it would probably definitely apply to Akira Kurosawa. He was very much involved in every aspect of a lot of the films that he made, especially the ones that he's really famous for, from writing to shooting all the way to editing. Like he usually edited everything himself, and his influence in all three of those things is pretty staggering. Like he wasn't just like, you know, he did all three, but like people really liked his writing, or he did all three, but people really think he was a good cinematographer. You know, like all three of them, he changed kind of how people did them.
Right.
Seven Samurai is a good example of like how his writing kind of rippled through. But even like the way his films look is a very striking kind of personal style that like a lot of people have tried to imitate, and a few people have like really, you know, kind of nailed. There's actually, I don't know how appropriate this is, but there's like this almost like reverence for him, like almost like near religious reverence for him amongst a lot of like mid-century filmmakers. And there's like an old anecdote, an old bit of folklore about Akira Kurosawa that says that he was the first director to point his camera and shoot the sun. There's actually shots in Rashomon where they're trucking through a forest and they're shooting the sun through like a layer of leaves and branches. And it seems like such a banal thing nowadays, like, oh, a shot of the sun, you know? But like, that's just, nobody did that before. Because it used to be like common knowledge that like you didn't want to flash your lens because you didn't want to overexpose your film or ruin other frames of your film. So people just kind of like didn't do it. But then like you listen to like directors like John Milius talk about like watching Rashomon in the theater for the first time and seeing a shot, like a tracking shot of the sun, and then being like, oh my god, this changes everything. And then like going home and like whatever like tiny project they were working on at the time, they're like scrapping it and like just trying to like do everything like Kurosawa. It's crazy like how electrifying his work is, you know.
It is fascinating. Like some of the videos that you recommended were, I didn't go to school for this. I don't really have a ton of history with it or anything, but like just watching short videos kind of breaking down how scenes in his movies were made and framed and talking about blocking and stuff. It's fascinating. Like I learned a lot about just cinematography watching those videos, and like someone who may not have a background in that kind of thing may watch one of these movies and not think much of it. But when someone starts to like kind of point out all of the little things, like how he directs your eye and how he places people in a shot, it is like you can't refute it. It's there and it's in front of your eyes, and you don't even think about it until someone points it out to you. But it's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think some of that too is like he had a very strong sense of visual storytelling, and even nowadays, like even today, we have all this benefit of hindsight. It is difficult to maximize every element of a film in a way like he did,
Yeah.
You get like every little thing is like kind of motivated. Every little bit of framing, every little bit of like dialogue, every little bit of editing, all has this like certain respect for the greater story going on that like is kind of, and again, this is where you kind of get into like the auteur theory thing of like, oh, is it really all the product of one man? In his case, he really did bring like this singular vision to the filmmaking process that is kind of lost.
Yeah.
In a lot of productions.
A lot of modern day films kind of feel like maybe too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing.
Yeah, you definitely get this like design by committee sort of symptom going on, and that leads to a lot of weird things like uneven editing. It leads to weird things like writing that is kind of just more like stage play writing,
right,
where you've got a bunch of characters in a set expositing at one another, and you're like shooting it and trying to make it look as interesting as possible, but like flailing around. These are the kind of situations that like Mifune was, or that Kurosawa, sorry, was really kind of adept at just avoiding. Like he just never put himself in that position. I think that their homage focuses mainly on subject matter.
Yeah.
There definitely was an eye for creating kind of like striking visual moments that might recall things like Akira Kurosawa.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily see as much fiber in it in the like sort of visual elements of the story as far as like cutscenes go. Mm-hmm. But they are approaching the subject matter and like the themes of their story with a very sort of human consciousness that Kurosawa, I think,
brought to those stories.
Was really known for, because this isn't just about I haven't finished the game yet, but I played a lot of it, and the main conflict going on with the main character Jin is not just like the external conflict of dealing with the invasion, but also this like internal conflict between like the old way, right? Like the way of honor and the samurai, and the new way, like his new tactics that are kind of incompatible with those old philosophies that he is employing in order to save his land and his people, right?
Yeah.
And Kurosawa was very interested in those kinds of stories about the old way coming and taking over, or about the new way coming and taking over the old, right?
Right.
So, for instance, like in Seven Samurai, there's this underlying theme of mechanization and like modern weaponry, like firearms, kind of making the samurai class obsolete. A lot of people die in Seven Samurai, but the samurai of the titular seven who die are all exclusively killed by gunshot.
Yeah.
And they are pretty much the only people in the movie who are killed by guns. Everyone else is killed by like a spear or sword or something like that. So that was kind of like a conscious thing on his effort. Like, he saw the samurai way of life as like being wiped out, right?
Right.
And he was very... So one thing that I think kind of differs between the tone that his stories strike and the tone that Ghost of Tsushima strikes is that he was always very socially conscious about like kind of the poison of violence, right? About how poorly people treat one another. But he had this very palpable kind of melancholy for the idea that like the old ways were dying.
Yeah.
That the past was this kind of, not perfect, but it had this like sort of nobility to it that whether or not you like it, it's being taken away, by the new. And I think Ghost of Tsushima sorry, is taking a slightly more progressive stance on its storytelling. Like I think it kind of is trying to walk this line between viewing the samurai traditions of old as like a burden to be overcome, and as like something deserving of respect and reverence. Like I don't think they're being like particularly disrespectful to these cultural institutions, but I think that like the recurring theme is that like this is untenable if this land is to survive, you know?
Yeah, that's definitely kind of what I'm getting from it. And honestly, when you think about the two kind of the dichotomy of the stories there, where you have the main conflict being the Mongol invasion of Tsushima versus what you talked about, where he's struggling to kind of come to terms with the fact or the idea that he might need to be dishonorable or do things that don't jive with, you know, that
adopt the new way.
Right. And I think so far, 'cause again, I too have not finished the game yet myself, but I find those moments when he battles with that internal conflict to be a tad more interesting than the more physical, in your face kind of conflict that's going on in the story.
Sure.
And I'm interested to see where those two stories are ultimately going to meet, because I think that's where it's gonna, you know, kind of make or break it, so to speak. But so far, all those moments where he's having flashbacks, training with his uncle, and like there's even moments like that have happened in game where he has just in the middle of a combat scenario that we talked about this in the actual podcast, where he has this moment where he has a flashback to training with his uncle in the first time he actually kills someone dishonorably in the field, and I thought that was a really cool way of injecting that into like the gameplay. But you know, I think a lot of people, when they think about, because Sucker Punch obviously was kind of going for that vibe when this game was announced, everyone was like, oh, this is very reminiscent of classic samurai and whatnot. But it wasn't, I think, until they officially announced that they have a Kurosawa mode in the game, and I think that's where a lot of people are kind of taking this idea and running with it, that they're drawing a lot of inspiration from Kurosawa, or they would point to that and say, well, that's obviously where they're implementing the most influence, I guess. And honestly, I haven't spent a ton of time playing around in that mode, but it kind of strikes me as just a cool visual effect more than anything, because you can kind of see the imperfections of, like, you know, the film grain and all that kind of stuff, and it's obviously black and white, and there's higher contrast and stuff, which is, you know, a more obvious comparison to those films. But honestly, the things that I think are where they are actually like digging a little bit deeper for those influences come into play with their use of like color and weather and sound and movement and stuff like that. There's a lot of that stuff in this game, which is what Kurosawa is also pretty well known for, especially in those films.
Yeah. I think that, so as far as the Kurosawa mode itself, well, first of all, the game, like, you know, the whole Kurosawa inspiration for the game, that's something that Sucker Punch themselves have been pretty vocal about and have been trying to like push forward. I think as part as, you know, just truth of this was what inspired us to make this game, and part also to like maybe try to lend a little bit of legitimacy to it.
Right.
As far as like the Kurosawa mode itself, it's neat. It's a fun little filter. I do like the effect, and I think that it highlights something that like I've kind of said for a while now, and I always get a lot of pushback about this, is that like color is not inherently better, you know?
Right.
I don't think when it comes to film that color films are inherently better than black and white films. I think that color is a very striking visual element that can be used very properly, but you know, if you look at a lot of like blockbuster movies nowadays, like, and I hate to pick on Marvel movies because I actually really love Marvel movies, but cinematographically, I guess, they tend to be pretty middle of the road. They, like, I don't think what's great about Marvel movies
pretty
is necessarily,
drab.
I don't think it's necessarily how they're shot, or how they look. And you get weird
I think
choices
Black
in color
Panther would
grading.
be the exception to that rule, maybe, if there was one to be an exception.
There's a few.
Yeah.
I think Black Panther is one. I think that Thor Ragnarok also was one. But a lot of them get into these really weird, like, muted color palettes where it's almost like they're just taking the fact that they're shooting for color for granted,
Yeah.
I think that black and white films can be just as visually compelling. I think the reason why maybe you don't see it as often is, first of all, modern sensibilities aren't quite used to black and white. Like, people just kind of have this generally, like, visceral reaction to it. But also because it's there, like, when you move to a high contrast, like monochrome, as the industry would call it, you don't have anywhere to hide your sins in lighting. It's very apparent if the image works or doesn't work on a lighting level just based on the contrast alone. So that's why, like, when movies like when Logan or when Mad Max Fury Road, had their black and white editions. Yeah. It's never quite so simple as just, like, desaturating the color. Right? Because you have to like also make sure that the exposure bias is accounting for that, like, loss of color by emphasizing contrast in the lighting. Right. I do think that the look of the black and white in Tsushima looks really good, especially in the photo mode. I really like the vintage.
I think that's one of my favorite filters.
The vintage black and white filter is really cool. It does a really good job of capturing that sort of old film grain look. And what is specific about that is that, like, older film stocks were more sensitive to light. So you get a higher contrast, and light areas of the frame tend to overexpose a lot easier.
Yeah.
So it has this interesting kind of, like, diffusion effect on the film that I think they captured really well, and I really like the look of it. As far as, like, the visual storytelling elements of Ghost of Tsushima, I think it biases pretty heavily towards kind of more of just, like, a modern understanding of filmmaking and cinematography.
Yeah.
I don't find a lot of the cutscenes particularly compelling. It's a lot of double coverage, two shots and reverse shot conversations, where the camera is not really doing anything other than delivering information, right? And that makes sense from a gameplay point of view. I think the reason why, like, I haven't been playing with Kurosawa mode on is because there is, like, this cognitive dissonance of watching a video game camera behave the way it does, but, like, look that way. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Like when I see the film grain and the black and white, it makes me think about the film camera, right? It kind of almost emphasizes the artificiality of it, and it makes me think about the camera and how the camera's moving. And when it's moving like a flying video game camera that doesn't exist as a real physical thing and can just go wherever it needs to go and is always, like, over the protagonist's right shoulder or whatever, it feels weird. It doesn't make sense visually.
I never thought of it that way. That's interesting for sure.
And I mean, that's definitely because those two things, like the film camera and the video game camera, exist to fill completely different purposes. In film, it's it is a information delivery device. I mean, it is how you're gathering the primary form of information of film, light, visual information. Right. But a lot of storytelling is done with the framing. I feel like video games, you get so caught up in the utility of it. Like, you need to have a camera to see what's going on, and you need that camera to be where it needs to be especially in an action game, right? It
Right,
needs
right.
it needs to be in a certain area. It needs to be out of the way. It needs to be showing you enough. And I mean, to the point where like in shooter games, like you have options to like change the field of view of the camera. You know, you can pull
Right.
it all the way back to give yourself a much more like wide, like stereoscopic view of the area. There's less room to be kind of like artistically creative with a camera in a video game
Yeah.
because of how you need it to behave.
Right. At the end of the day, I was kind of shocked. Not shocked, but I think there was maybe a missed opportunity, especially if they were trying to evoke thoughts of Kurosawa and his style of filmmaking. Maybe a missed opportunity in terms of how they did frame the shots in the cutscenes, which are obviously more static and
Yeah,
they have
I
more
think-
control over it at any given moment.
I think that was their place to really show like their homework.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's like a studio thing, or I don't know if it's like an actual directing thing. I don't know if they were just like, well, we want to maintain a pretty standard kind of modern styling because that's what's going to be appealing to the widest to the widest audience.
Yeah.
Or if it was, literally just a fact of like, I kind of feel this way sometimes about video game developers in that like they get a lot of inspiration from films and they like films and they kind of want to do something like a film in a game, but their experience is in building games and not necessarily in like using a camera, right?
Right.
And it kind of shows. Like I kind of feel like there's a filmic quality, or at least there's lessons in visual storytelling that filmmakers could teach game designers.
Right.
That, if game designers weren't, overworked hundreds of hours and like had billions of other things to worry about, like they could fold in. And I think a lot of times cutscenes just kind of come out as being like whatever, right?
Yeah.
I will say that there are moments like the mission headers are usually pretty well composed and pretty interesting looking. And especially like the duel scenes. Mm-hmm. That's where they're really flexing and trying to be like, hey, see, we can do the samurai cinema thing.
Yeah.
And it's really cool. I just wish that I just wish that was like a little more present throughout the rest of the game, I
think about the one shot that, I've played 25 hours of this game so far, and I'm still thinking about that sweeping shot of in the title card sequence at the very beginning.
That's really cool.
Here he rides out on the horse and he's like kind of leaning over and like letting his hand brush against the flowers.
He's running
and
through the
whatnot.
grass. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was such an amazing shot, and that is a good example of like an interesting shot that is almost, I mean, not exclusive to video games, but like it's so much easier to do stuff like that.
Right. Right.
That's not necessarily like the visual style that would have been employed by these old directors, but pretty much because they couldn't make their camera move.
I
like
think
that,
if they were if they could see something like a shot like that, they would have
Sure.
appreciated it at the very, at least it was pretty impactful.
Yeah, I think that was a really strong opening, and then that really got me like primed up for like, oh wow, these guys are like really bringing it, And then I keep playing the game and I'm watching the cutscenes of like him talking to Sensei Ishikawa and like him talking to Yuna and stuff like that, and it's
like you're playing Mass Effect. It's like it's cutting back and forth between them.
And I'm seeing more like Paul Greengrass, than I am fucking Akira Kurosawa, and I say that with the utmost respect. I think Paul Greengrass has a very interesting visual style that works very well for the kind of movies he makes, and I think the movies he made were so popular that like his style kind of just ended up in the mainstream, into places it doesn't really belong,
Right.
like that whole shaky cam. He does use a lot of like long like telephoto lenses. He likes to shoot from far away, but you get these shots where like you're doing reverse coverage on somebody and you're putting the back of the other person's head like kind of in the frame to make it feel like you're spying on a conversation, right?
Yeah.
In Paul Greengrass's movies, when he was doing like Bloody Sunday, when he was doing the Bourne movies, that totally works. That makes sense from a storytelling perspective. But you just see it everywhere now, and it doesn't make any sense to me half the time.
Yeah.
And this has a lot of that. Like this has a lot of like the cutscene directors went and watched like a bunch of modern movies and were like, okay, we're just going to do it like that, and then you get this kind of like bland, homogenous, people talking at each other.
Right. As an outsider, I have an answer. If you want to think about yours for a second.
For sure. I'd love.
I think, based on the limited knowledge I have and the few movies I've seen from Kurosawa, I feel like movement and color are kind of where they take the most advantage of his like actual. Maybe not. Well, he did films in color. I haven't actually seen his. He did.
And you know
I saw
what?
several shots of them. I haven't actually seen those films myself, but they were striking.
He was using black and white a lot longer than a lot of contemporary directors, and a lot of that just had to do with economic issues in Japan at the time, and he kind of became known for black and white and then stuck with it for a while. But when he made the switch to color, and he was doing stuff like Ron, I mean, he came in and was like, okay, I'm gonna start lighting my movies for color now, and fucking nailed that too. Like it's fucking crazy, actually.
Can't do any wrong.
One of his last movies was actually a film about Vincent van Gogh. And color is everything in that movie, like it's such a striking part of the way that film looks. So while I do think that the color aspect doesn't necessarily line up with like his older, maybe more famous works, his use of color was equally masterful.
Yeah, it was something that was still very prominent to him, and I think that's color and movement specifically. I think are where they really capitalize on it in this game, because we talked about maybe the cutscenes not being visually striking from a blocking or framing perspective, and it's just kind of talking heads, well acted and well voice acted and whatnot. But despite that, not a single frame in this game to me feels uninteresting, because something is always moving. Whether it's the wind or the weather blowing the grass, or particle effects, flower petals in the wind, or embers, or whatever it is. Everything is striking, even if what you're actually looking at may be quote unquote boring.
That is a huge part of his visual style, in fact. And I agree with you that they have really taken that sort of philosophy to heart. When they show scenes of like him stepping into the hot springs, or like him just hanging out with his horse, like feeding it an apple or something like that, right? The character is very much in his surrounding. The camera doesn't do anything to remove him from his background, doesn't do anything to remove him from the nature around him, and in fact a lot of that nature is providing a visual texture through the kind of movement that you're talking about, and that is bedrock solid for Akira Kurosawa's visual style. He was very interested. He had such a mind for mise en scène. Every element of the frame he is controlling it somehow. You watch his movies and you think like, oh wow, that was a windy day, or like, oh, this was really cool that they shot this on a rainy day. No. Every element of nature you see in those movies is there because he put it there. He was famous for just renting out like half a dozen wind machines and just putting them off the side, and the man was a fucking madman. Like the rain sections in Seven Samurai, they had 6 fire trucks spraying fire hoses to make that rain because he wanted rain. He was very conscious about injecting these sort of visually interesting elements of nature into his frame. And he also, from an artistic standpoint, was very reverent of nature. And he didn't really do a lot of stuff to pull his characters out of that. If a character's walking through the woods, they are in the woods. He's not obscuring the leaves behind him. He's putting leaves behind him. He's putting leaves in front of them. They are walking through a thick, lush forest that even if it's in black and white, you can see exactly how green it is. And that's kind of when I'm talking about the visual style of Ghost of Tsushima's cutscenes, especially ones that involve him talking to other characters. That's kind of what I'm talking about. Is if you pay attention, a lot of them are shot in such a way where they're just removing their character from their environment. They're shooting on a very long lens, which Kurosawa was known for, but he was known for doing that to shoot multiple subjects, not like a single subject, you know?
Yeah.
And you'll look at like Jin talking to Yuna, right? And their backgrounds are just like completely blurred out and obscured, you know? And the only thing that's really in focus is Jin's face while he's talking, and then Yuna's face while he's talking. And it's just Jin and then Yuna, and then Jin and then Yuna. And there's nothing really, there's not a lot going on there to add any sort of visual texture that you would expect to see from something like a Kurosawa film, where he's using the set to build frames within frames, and he's got, you know, rain in the background to add a visual texture. He's got wind moving horizontally to add a different, like, a different line to draw your eye, you know?
Right.
That's the kind of stuff that I think this game lacks a little bit in the cutscene department.
Absolutely. And it is worth noting that like that visual texture is like they have in spades just kind of in the world.
Out in the world, yeah, for sure.
Is,
like the guiding wind is such a like inspired idea, I think. Is such a like, yeah, obviously
it's refreshing
that's
as hell.
Obviously that's what this kind of mechanic would look like in a samurai game.
And honestly, I'm really kind of shocked that this game isn't just like a technical mess or like doesn't chug, because there is not a single moment in this game where like it's still. Like everything is always moving, swaying, blowing in the wind, like and it's seamless. I was really impressed by just how smooth everything is. Which
I'm surprised that my PS4 doesn't sound like a jet engine when I play this game.
Absolutely.
Especially coming off of The Last of Us, which it very much did. My favorite thing about the game is... this sounds kind of mean, and I don't mean it to sound this way.
I love the mean answers. Bring it.
I really like the small things. I really like the interstitials and like the sort of minor details between all the killing. I think that the combat is great and I'm having a lot of fun with it. But it's like, and you know, that's the main attraction here. Mm-hmm. But I think it's the little things. I think it's like the haiku, and I think it's the Inari shrines. And
I did not think the haiku was going to be as. Like,
I know. In the hot springs, yeah. Like all of this stuff, I think, is really interesting from a thematic standpoint, from like a player standpoint, and it also like you want to talk about like where do the inspirations of Kurosawa show through in this game. That kind of stuff to me is vital to building that sense, because again, like it's these moments where like Jin stops and just like exists in nature for a minute, and feels like part of a larger whole, and that sort of reverence for nature is not only like very prevalent in Japanese culture, that's like a big part of like Shinto beliefs, but it's also a big part of Kurosawa's like oeuvre, if you will, you know, like that presence of nature, and for Jin to like be able to stop and take a second, just like sit by a stream and like write a haiku, you know, that's the kind of like chill, you know, just like fucking decompression that I would expect to see in a game that is purportedly like taking inspiration from samurai cinema, you know.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the combat, and I think they even managed to work little details that I think are, because we talked about the the standoffs. So I had watched that. I haven't seen the movie, but you sent me the link for the clip. I forgot what movie it's from, where he has the showdown.
Standoff from the standoff from the end of Sanjuro.
Yes. Yeah. Which, by the way, now I want to watch Sanjuro.
It's great, and it's a sequel to Yojimbo, so
which I have now seen, so I'm definitely down to watch it. But they have their standoff, and there is like a solid minute maybe of just like where you know, like, okay, it's on. One of these people is gonna strike first, and it's like a minute. And I was sitting here watching this yesterday, and I was I was like sweating. I was like, what the fuck? I almost wish they would let it.
Like,
it's insane.
That clip is almost 5 minutes long, and it is the most static thing in that movie, probably. Like it's kind of amazing. Like, he knows when to do what, you know? Like, he knows
Right.
when to just, like, let a shot hang and be still and be quiet for, like, just a little bit longer than you think it's going to be. And it, like, really builds this tension. And then when the movement does come back in, it's like, whoa! Like, oh! You know, like, that scene spends, like, 3 or 4 minutes just being completely still. And then when they both draw swords and swipe and you just see that, like, arterial blood spurt just, like, take over half the frame, it's like, what the fuck did I just see? It's crazy.
Also, I watched that scene like 3 times, and I went back to the moment they drew their swords, and I slowed it down to like 25% speed.
Yeah.
Just because I wanted to see like how does what I'm seeing happen so fast actually translate and like make sense? And it absolutely does. Like, I watched their movements, and it's like, I totally see how he fucking won that standoff, and that's cool. But like in Ghost of Tsushima, I almost wish they would let those pauses hold longer on the standoffs. Everyone I've done so far is like maybe 5 or 6 seconds. I want to get in a standoff where I'm sitting there for like 30 seconds and like not sure, and maybe that we do get to that point and it just gets steadily harder. But like,
I can't tell you how many standoffs I've fucked up in this game because I'm trying to like fuck around with photo mode while it's going on.
Yeah. Me too.
This is kind of unrelated, but I did want to mention that other actor besides Toshiro Mifune in that scene that we're talking about was Tatsuya Nakadai, and he's a big name in samurai cinema on his in his own right. I just found out he's still alive today, and he's in a samurai movie coming out this year, or was supposed to come out this year. Like dude's fucking nuts. The dude is crazy. He's so good. He's also the main guy in Sword of Doom and in Harakiri, which are 2 other classic samurai films, and he's really awesome.
I have to check that out.
Yeah, but getting back to what we were talking about, like the little details, I think the fact that, like, you know, the way that Jin draws his sword and replaces his sword, like the way you can do the swipe on the D-pad, just have him like swipe the blade and then put it back in the traditional style, the way that you can have him just like bow, and the way that like the game, you know, it's kind of weird to say rewards, but like, you know, like if you walk up to a dead peasant and you bow at their corpse, and like Jin says something, you know.
I discovered that yesterday.
Oh yeah, I do it all the time. I bow all the time. He'll say something, and it's like the game developers encouraging you to do that role play, you know, to like use you don't get anything game benefit out of it, but like it adds such a like it's such this nice little touch that like I'm so happy that it's there, you know. Absolutely.
I think. I totally agree with everything you just said too, but one of my favorite things about the game, I think, is, and I've said this the word that keeps coming into my head, and I've said it a lot already, I know, but elegance, man. Yeah. Elegance of design in this game kind of elevates everything. I think at its core, I say this, you know, with knowing and being open about the fact that I love these kinds of games, but this is a pretty by the books open world action game. It takes pages right out of the Ubisoft handbook in a lot of cases, but it uses like clean, minimalistic like UI design and these like really soft, elegant sound design or sound elements that just make everything so serene and just lovely, man. It's playing this game feels lovely.
It does. There's a lot of stuff about this game that like. A lot of little things that would really bother me in lesser games, you know, but something about, you know, and you say elegance, and while I agree that that's probably like the goal, I do still feel a lot of the grit of this game. Like I feel a lot of the like rough edges and stuff, but like something about the sincerity of it, you know, like, it's not a perfect game and it does have its problems, but like they really put their heart into it, and you can kind of feel it, you know. You can feel that a lot of care and a lot of research and a lot of thought went into the choices that they made, and it doesn't always work for sure, but I think that level of detail and that level of respect does a lot to make this thing greater than the sum of its parts.
And there's probably a lot. A lot.
you know, and it's tough to get so hypothetical with it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But
I mean, a lot of this is stuff that it's really more of just like,
I think
if and when they make a sequel, there's things they're going to have
there's
to address.
There's two things I would like.
Mm-hmm.
I would like them to really step up and rethink how they do cutscenes. You know, kind of going back to what we said before. I think even if you're not like imitating Kurosawa's style directly, I think just a more thoughtful approach to how you shoot like info dump scenes would be appreciated. Not that they're terrible as they are now. I just think that they're a little bog standard, you know?
Yeah, like just experiment with ways to make them maybe stand out more, because they are acted well.
Because it's like
they are technically
every
sound.
other part of this game is trying really hard to lend itself to a striking visual style, except for that, you know? And the other thing that I would like is, and I, you know, this is probably a huge ask, but I really think if they took the effort, it would go a long way. To I would like to see options to not only change like the audio track, but also the lip syncing. Like, I think if you play in the Japanese audio, like, it would be nice if they had animated lip syncing to go along with that.
I mean, that is honestly the only reason I'm playing in English, is because I just have a tendency to, if I have the choice and I decide to play the one that doesn't have the proper lip sync, my eyes will not stop focusing on the lip sync.
It's a shame too, because it's weird, because the Japanese audio track is really good. It's really good. But yeah, it's just
I played the Japanese audio track for a short while before I decided to switch it back to English, but luckily the English voice acting is very well done as well. I don't feel like I'm having a lesser experience. They did a really good job.
I think the English track is just fine, and I think I just think that, like, I definitely would, you know, if it wasn't such a distracting experience, I would definitely be playing with the Japanese audio track, which, I mean, which they obviously put a lot of care into. I mean, you hear a lot from, you know, we've talked about like how this game's being received in Japan, and, you know, Brad had expressed some kind of like, okay, well, that's not the end all be all, because, you know, how many Japanese game reviewers are history experts, this, that, which, sure, fine. But one thing that I do hear that I do really trust Japanese audiences on is them saying that, like, the Japanese in the game is very spot on, is very appropriate and naturalistic to how a Japanese native speaker would speak. You know, that you don't get weird Japanese, quote unquote, like you would get from, like, you know, that was a problem with Isle of Dogs, the Wes Anderson movie. You know, there's a lot of Japanese in that movie, but it's just kind of like like not quite as bad as like plugging it into Google Translate, but it's very like, it's technically correct, but nobody would write or talk like that. You know? Gotcha. Kind of thing.
Well, it's good to know that you know, if you do play it that way, it's you know, it's true and it's accurate and all that. And if I had to change anything, I mean, honestly, I feel like, and this may sound harsher than I want it to, but I just kind of would like to see them iterate on maybe the general gameplay loop a little bit more. It is kind of rote. I think everything that surrounds the core loop of this game, I think, is kind of astounding. You know, the visuals, the sound design, the themes and the subject matter, I think, is all really interesting and great. But the core loop is, you know, we've done it before. Luckily, the combat kind of props it up and makes it fun and worthwhile. And, you know, sure. I'm going to be honest, I'm surprised Brad's enjoying this game as much as he just kind of historically just doesn't. He's not a huge fan of these kinds of games, but he's loving it. And I think that speaks to the quality of it quite a bit.
You know, I think that like us, he appreciates these games when they're done well, and I think that's kind of like what is happening here. I definitely do agree with you, though, that like that main loop is a little rote, but it's one of those things where, like, if this game came out like in 2012, we'd still be talking about it.
People would be losing their minds
about it, you know. But now
sure.
We've kind of done this a lot. You know,
right. And honestly, you know, this game has been already selling like hotcakes and whatnot. I think when you get right down to it, this does, despite the fact that technically speaking, it's one of the best looking games, not only on a platform, but maybe I've played this whole generation. But it does feel like it has a little bit of that quote unquote like first in the series, syndrome. Like,
well, yeah,
they took more creative risk with like the presentation than I think they did with the mechanics. And now that it's established, if they are going to move forward and make this an IP or make it a repeating property and make sequels and whatnot, they're probably going to have a lot more freedom and wiggle room to experiment there. But
and I think the possibility of this becoming a franchise is almost certain. So hopefully we'll see some interesting evolution.
It'll be interesting to see how the series continues if it does, and 2 to see if they're going to continue to kind of aim for, if they're going to try to continue to pay homage to like Kurosawa, to see how they continue to step up their game in that regard, because I hope they keep doing it. I hope they keep trying, because where they did, where that was their target, I think they did a pretty damn good job in this first go around. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes for sure. Thank you everyone for watching. This was hopefully the first of many gaming-centric videos that we'll be producing each month here with the help of our Patreon video producers. Subjects and formats will run the gamut, so we're excited to see where this goes. If you're interested in helping us produce future videos, visit us at patreon.com/4player. Otherwise, catch our weekly podcast at 4playernetwork.com and check back next month for another video. Cheers.